Food is in short supply, December the 9th. Changing things up a little bit this morning, I made bannock with a mixture of flour and cornmeal. It looked like I had enough flour for about a week before I would run out. With no jam left and my sugar all but gone, I decided to save the sugar for putting on my oatmeal. I could drink sugarless coffee, but that oatmeal was horrible with nothing added. No matter what I did, there was going to be a few days where my meals were going to be very plain indeed. I decided that I'd better start carrying my gun again to try and pick up some grouse, even though I had not seen one in a while, other than that huge flock by Amabel Lake. Not sure how long it would last, because carrying that extra few pounds in my hands wore me out. I would try strapping it across my pack, and hopefully that would be easier. My guess was that with no rabbits anywhere near here, the fox and marten were hitting the grouse population pretty hard too. Not to mention all the birds I had shot earlier. With my bannock finished, I saved some and mixed up a small amount of oatmeal. That and coffee was my breakfast. At least my coffee looked like it would last till the pickup day. That was good, because I really didn't want to think about not having any coffee. Finally, I gathered my gear and made my way down to the lake and onto the Chain Lake Trail. At my fox snare set, the wind had blown the snow in and covered the snares. The fox had walked right down the one trail and stepped right over the snare. Darn. But once in the bush, I had better luck, picking up a marten and a squirrel before I hit lake number 3. My wolf snares were not touched, and come to think of it, I hadn't seen a fresh wolf track all day so far. Moving north, I picked up another marten between lakes 4 and 5 and a beaver at lake 8. Now, do I pull this house or take another beaver? Finally deciding that I'd already taken extra beavers from too many houses, I've opted to pull the sets. With one more marten between the trail, between Chain Lakes and the Little Fraser River, today's catch had turned out to be quite good. Once on the river, I saw where a few otters had slid down the ice and buried under the snow. From there, they must have gotten into the water somehow, and that was good. They were headed in the direction of my new otter set. Back on track, I added 2 squirrels and a weasel to my pack by the time I hit Hiawatha Lake. Looked like I would be busy skinning tonight. As I was snowshoeing down the lake, I glanced to my right, and there on the shore were 3 moose browsing on the balsam trees. Why were they eating those things? I could never understand. But they must be getting something out of it. I wondered if I could get close enough to put a .22 shot right behind the ear of one of the moose. Would that kill it? It would sure solve my whole food shortage problem. But there was no way I could talk myself into taking the chance of wounding one of those animals and having it wander off somewhere to die. So licking my lips, I moved on south and left several hundred pounds of fresh meat standing there staring at me. Back at camp, with a cup of tea in hand, I again thought of those moose. Boy, a thick, juicy moose steak would sure taste great right now. But at least I had a beaver that I could eat some of the meat from. Well, I figured I'd better get skinning the fur, and so got started on the beaver. The fur was still a little wet, but by lifting the tail up on the skin up on the nails, it would be okay with some airflow between the fur and the board. Once it was skinned, I removed the fat for my lamps and the back legs for food. The rest went for bait, which I was plenty short of also. Deboning one of the legs, I rolled it in cornmeal and I fried it up nice and crispy. With some warmed up bannock, it made an edible meal. Well, edible by my standards anyway. But remember, I'd eaten pancakes with mouse turds in them. Soon all the animals that were thawed were skinned and stretched, and it was time for some rest. Tomorrow was going to be another long day. With the sounds of Kapuskasing radio playing in my ears, I wondered to myself where the rest of the animals of the north were hiding. I didn't think I was far enough north to encounter wolverines, but the rest of them, like lynx and fishers, should be around. But I guess with no rabbits, the lynx would starve anyways, and come to think of it, I'd not seen a porcupine or even a track of one since I'd arrived either. Maybe that's why there were no fishers, but more likely it was also the lack of rabbits. December 10th, 2 weeks until pickup. As I awoke, I realized that it was now only 2 weeks before the plane was coming to get me. I was starting to look forward to having some real food to eat and a nice cold bottle of Coke. Filling my belly with Bannock and oatmeal, I washed it all down with a couple of cups of hot coffee. I was drinking it black since I had decided to save the precious sweetener for the morning oatmeal. Planning on carrying my gun with me just in case I saw some grouse again, I packed my gear for the trip and started out. "You ready to go there, Lobo?" I asked as he finished off the last of the dried dog food that I'd poured out for him. I knew he'd rather have some beaver meat, but I needed that for bait, so dry dog food it was. Finally, we were on our way, so I had my snowshoes pointed north and I followed them all the way to the end of the lake. Having picked up nothing at all before I reached Little Fraser River, on and on I traveled, checking each box for bait as I went. Arriving at Otter Lake with only a squirrel to show for my effort, I was a little disappointed with the production. But at the next beaver house I had a real nice beaver, and checking my otter set, I was very happy to pull out a big dog otter. The lure set had worked. I was going to have to get some more fish-shaped attractants out there. Once I came to the big log, I decided I was going to cut that branch out of there finally. I tossed down the pack and pulled the axe out. Taking a couple swings at the big branch was a waste of time. It just vibrated and the axe hardly made a mark in it. So grabbing it by the end, I forced it all the way down, and holding it with my left hand, I lifted my axe to cut it right at snow level. Suddenly the end of the branch, which I'd been holding on, broke off in my hand, and the rest of it came up and caught me right in the mouth. The force was enough to make me do a somersault backwards into the snow. Shaking my head, I sat up and, of course, looked around to make sure no one had seen that stupid move. Boy, what a wallop, though. My mouth was cut on the inside in 4 places and on the outside in 3. One of my teeth was broken and another was loose. Well, but I guess if I could take that punch, I didn't have to worry about any bar fights bothering me. Getting into my feet, I dug down into the snow to the base of the branch and with a few swings of the axe, the branch was done. Yeah, I probably should have done that in the first place. My hindsight is pretty good. Finished, I reloaded my pack and the beaver drag and moved out. As I walked, I could feel my face starting to swell up already. But it reminded me that even a simple thing like cutting a branch could turn into a serious problem out here. Finally, at the Amabel camp, it was like the marten had fallen off the face of the earth. I had seen the odd track, but not enough to get excited about. Not even any wolf tracks in that entire distance. With enough daylight left, I decided to check the remaining traps so I could get an early start in the morning. One more small beaver and a marten finally in the trap on the east side of Amabel Lake. But this beaver was enough out of this set, and I had only one beaver set in the whole trail. I could always go and set the house on Skookashu, but that meant having to spend an extra night here every trip. I decided that it could wait until I came back with a snowmobile. I was not sure where all those grouse had gone, but my rifle was feeling heavy, and without any grouse around, I was not going to be carrying it again. Back at camp, with a nice fire going and a hot cup of tea in my hands, I hung the beavers to dry. Luckily, the weather was still fairly warm out, so the cabin warmed up enough that the otter was able to dry even away from the stove. When the first beaver had dried good enough, I skinned it out and gave Lobo a good chunk of meat for his supper. Cutting some off for myself, I cut the rest into bait-sized pieces and then started on number 2. The dry fur I left in the pack to stay frozen until we got back to Hiawatha the next day. The otter dried off nicely, so I rough-skinned it and stowed it away with the beaver hides. The second beaver carcass went outside and I covered it with firewood to keep the ravens off. The whiskey jacks could still get their little heads in there to eat a bit, but I didn't mind since they were too small to eat much of it. One more cup of tea and I got myself settled between the mattresses. Boy, did I need another good sleeping bag. December the 11th. Well, in the morning I made an executive decision. I was not going to spend another night in this camp without a sleeping bag. The temperature had dropped during the night, and I had spent the night flipping like a pig on a spit trying to stay warm. I would pull all the traps out east of the beaver house, just between Otter and Amabel Lakes. That would give me a 7 to 8 mile trip one way, and I thought a 15-mile return trip would be doable in a day, considering there were very few beaver sets anyway, which meant less ice chopping. It might be a little tight for daylight, but it was not like I had not already gone home after dark fairly regular anyways. I would be back to reset this area after Christmas when I hopefully would have a snowmobile to get around. With the decision made, I hurried through breakfast and rushed off to pull the marten sets. An hour later I was heading south with my pack fully loaded, pulling traps as I went. Leaving the beaver and otter sets in, I added another marten set near the house, since this was as far as I was going to be traveling each trip. Boy, the temperature had really dropped because this cold was biting into my face whenever I got into an open area. The wind caused my eyes to water, and while crossing Otter Lake, my right eye froze shut again. But soon enough I was off the lake and back behind the sheltering bush. Just past the lake I caught a nice marten in the first set, but then there was nothing. Mile after mile I traveled with not a track, not a single animal in all the traps. The only life I saw was one of my old friends, the great gray owl. He or she sat atop its perch as I traveled past, its head rotating on top of its body, following my progress until I disappeared around a bend in the river. I guess that owl and I were the only things stupid enough to be out here on this cold day. Finally back on Hiawatha Lake, I was down to the home stretch, and the wind was no longer in my eyes, but was now hitting the back of my head. Collar up and hat pulled down, I arrived at the camp with just a touch of frostbite on my right ear. Getting a fire going, I noticed that my stalactite and corresponding ice flow had expanded with no fire to keep them in check. With bannock, oatmeal, and some beaver for supper, I splurged and had a nice cup of coffee with it. Gosh, was I ever getting sick of that oatmeal. I've been checking my fish lines every day with nothing to show for it, so I had decided to try jigging for a while. Half hour later I gave up on that idea and I went to cut some firewood before night set in. Back in the camp I checked the fur, and since the animals were not going to be thawed till morning, I fiddled around with my snowshoes, replacing a length of the lamp wick that was close to wearing through. Checking on my food again, hoping that I had missed something, and I hadn't. I again realized that I would be completely out of most everything other than my favorite, oatmeal, in a week. With my bait needed, I poured Lobo a pile of his dry dog food, and looking at it I thought, what the heck? And popped a nugget in my mouth. Tastes like chicken. Actually, I didn't think it was all that bad, but for now I would stick with the human food, even though the dog food tasted better than oatmeal. Deciding to stay at camp the next day to stock up on firewood, I finally kicked back and with a cup of tea, listened to some Kapuskasing radio. Boy, would a can of Coke and a Mars bar go over good right now, I thought to myself. It was unreal how much I craved anything sweet. I had not had any substantial sugar for weeks now, and for a guy that would normally drink several pop a day and had a terrible sweet tooth, that was saying a lot. Waking late, I sipped on my coffee and filled my belly. Cornmeal cakes made with the last of my cornmeal. I'll tell you what, anyone who wants to go on a diet, I can recommend one. Oatmeal, cornmeal, bannock, and the occasional bit of meat. Add in snowshoeing 8 to 15 miles a day with a good load on your back, and in no time there will not be an ounce of fat on you. Getting started on my fur was the first order of business. While I was skinning the marten that I'd caught on the jump over toward East Amabel, something weird happened. I was pulling the hide past the front legs and then over the neck when the entire pelt tore in half. I was like, what the heck? I'm not that strong. The pelt was torn in a perfectly straight line. Upon closer inspection, I felt a piece of wire along the line where the fur separated. Excuse me. It was a rabbit snare wire. The marten had got itself caught in a rabbit snare, broke the wire, and traveled, at least to my best guess, 15 to 20 miles to get into my marten set. Unless there was someone trapping closer than that, and I had no idea about. But with my sewing kit, I sewed the two halves together, and I did such a good job that the pelt was not even graded damaged. But of course, they don't use the skin up by the head anyways. By that time, the sun had warmed the air a little bit, and I was ready to go out and cut some firewood. Green birch was still plentiful, and the dry wood was too, but the dry wood was getting further to carry every day. It would sure be nice when I had a snowmobile and a sleigh to drag wood with, not to mention a chainsaw for cutting. It was scary how fast the wood disappeared in this real cold weather, and we had not even reached the coldest months yet. It would not be a good thing to get hurt out here and not have enough wood to last until the plane came to get me. By the time I had been working at it for several hours, the wood pile was at a respectable level. I figured I should be enough for a few weeks at least. Finally, before dark, I went and checked my camp set. Nothing. But the mice and squirrels had been eating the bait, and it needed to be replaced. But that could wait till tomorrow. Now was the time for breakfast, or was it supper? The food is all the same, no matter what meal it was. Cup of tea in hand, I relaxed in bed and listened to the radio. Making a few notes before I closed my eyes for the night, I wondered again how the guys were doing back in White River. Probably sitting in the bar right now having a beer after a big juicy steak dinner. Ah, crap. I'm going to sleep. My eyes snapped open. Not quite sure what had woke me up, but then a growl from Lobo let me know. Funny though, he had not done that in a while. But then the reason became clear. Wolves. And they were real close. Grabbing my coat, slipping on my boots, and with rifle in hand, I snuck down to the lake shore. There in the moonlight, about halfway to the point, I could see them. Through the scope, I saw 3 wolves standing facing me, probably wondering what I was. Resting the gun against a tree, I kept my crosshairs on one, waiting for it to turn broadside. About 200 yards out, I was figuring should be a dead center shot. I just wanted a bigger target. Finally, as if on cue, they turned to the north and I let loose on my victim. Watching it go down, I cranked the bolt and slid another bullet in the chamber. With the gun emptied on the high-speed animals, I looked back to check on the one that I'd shot, just in time to watch it hobble towards the bush. Wishing I had thought to bring extra bullets, I just watched as it made the bush line and disappeared. Tracking it in the morning seemed like a better plan than going off half-cocked following a wounded wolf in the darkness. Checking the moon, I realized that there was still a lot of night left, so I made my way up the hill and crawled back into bed. Sleep didn't come right away, but eventually I drifted off. With just a quick coffee, breakfast was postponed until I got back, hopefully with my wolf. Making a beeline for the spot that the wolf had disappeared into the bush, I immediately found a good blood trail. He had bedded down about 50 yards inside the bush line, and from the amount of blood there, he couldn't have gone much further. Another 100 yards and I found another bed. This one, however, had a big wolf lying in it, right on. I had hit him just back of the chest on his left side, and the bullet had exited on it at his second rib, missing the heart, but obviously had done enough damage to put him down. I was so excited. Never had I imagined having the chance to shoot a wolf, but after all my dealings with them, it felt good to come out on the winning end of this deal. Boy, he was a beauty. Real big and nicely furred. Flipping the partially frozen animal up onto my shoulders, I fought my way to the lake shore and back to camp. With a good fire going, he should be thawed out by the time I returned from Pody Lake. As I was eating my delicious breakfast, I realized that it was 10 days till the plane was coming in to get me. Funny, but now I really look forward to getting to town and seeing some people again. Mostly I think it was the chance for some real food that excited me. I would have to rush to make arrangements for a snowmobile when I got also. Hopefully the bank would lend me some money till the first sale was over. That would sure make the trip to Amabel and Pody Lakes a lot easier. And the trails could be extended to East Amabel and on to Fraser Lake. With my pack loaded, I strapped on my shoes and headed southwest on the trail to Pody Lake. Coming up to the second trap, I could see a marten hanging in the trap, but something was wrong. Suddenly a squirrel jumped from the hanging marten to the tree, and another squirrel landed back on the marten. But this time, by the time I reached the set, the squirrels had each made a couple of trips to the marten and back. Not quite sure what they'd been up to, but I soon figured it out. They'd been grabbing mouthfuls of fur off the marten. I could only imagine they were using it to line their nest or something. It was kind of funny, other than the ruined fur, to watch them jump and almost frantically tear out the fur. The little critters were tag teaming him, like they were paying this marten back for all their squirrel cousins it had ever killed. All I knew was that my $30 marten was now almost worthless. Those squirrels were lucky I was too lazy to carry my gun with me. By the time I reached Pody Lake, I had another marten and a squirrel in my pack. With no beaver sets out here anymore, I knew that my pack was not going to get too heavy today. Moving south along the lake, I almost walked right past my fox set. If it wasn't for the fox jumping around, I may have done just that. He'd gotten caught around the middle, so I guess that I needed to make my snares a bit smaller. Holding him down with my axe, I grabbed it by the throat and put my knee right on its heart. I could feel it beating under my knee, so I applied all of my weight, and within a minute the animal was dead. He was a gorgeous, heavy-furred red. I noticed his legs had more brown on him than normal, like he was trying to be a cross fox, but just couldn't quite get there. Well, and just to be clear, a cross fox is not a cross between a silver and a red. It gets its name from the brown stripe that runs from one front leg across the shoulders and down the other side. And then with the dark line that runs down the length of its back, it forms a perfect cross. They really are a beautiful pelt, and I wish this one had all the goods, but it was not to be. The cross fox pelts were worth a lot of money. I continued on, and just before Little Pody, I picked up another marten. Maybe this taking the extra day between trips is a good idea. Seems to be more fur today after the slow spell I'd been having. On Little Pody, I came across the track of 4 wolves following my trail along the shoreline. But when I turned north up the trail, they just continued down the lake. A few hundred yards in the bush, I crossed the tracks of a single big wolf paralleling the lake shore. I'd seen this several times before and wondered to myself again if this animal was trying to push any prey between him and the lake out to his buddies. If that is what they were doing, it sure would be a good hunting tactic, like deer hunters pushing bush. A short distance further, Lobo charged ahead, and with an explosion of wings, a rough grouse flew up and landed in a tree about 15 feet off the ground. Cursing myself for not bringing the gun today, I looked longingly at the bird sitting there. But his attention was on the dog, so an idea came to mind. Moving back a ways, I cut down a tall, thin tree, and trimmed all the branches off it. Now, with the 15-foot pole in my hand, I moved cautiously towards the bird. With the bird's attention still on Lobo and the pole straight up in the air, I lined it up and with an awkward swing nailed the bird right off its perch. Knowing that it would probably only be stunned, I rushed to where it had landed, but no worries. Lobo had the grouse firmly held between his jaws. Oh boy, a good supper tonight. I thought it funny though that the bird had been so engrossed in the dog that it had totally ignored me. I had an idea that if I made a small snare with the rabbit wire that I had brought, and obviously had no other use for, and attached it to a long pole, I could probably, by moving very slow, slip the snare right over a grouse's head and snag it like that. I would try it again if I ever saw another one that low to the ground. And I have caught many grouse like that since that day. Back at camp, I went down for water, and there it was, a small pike on my fishing line. What a day. Fins and feathers again, baby. Oh man, supper was going to be a treat tonight. To top it off, I made a cup of coffee to have with my supper. Strange, you know, that something as simple as a coffee with a good meal can become such a special thing all of a sudden. Just the thought of not having to eat oatmeal for even one meal was almost too much to ask for. God, I hated that stuff. With my belly full of the best meal I had eaten in a long time, my fur all hung to thaw, and a cup of tea, I listened to some music, made some notes, and let sleep take over. December 14th. Morning comes with the realization that I'm down to about 1 day of flour left. That means there was going to be a week of eating nothing but oatmeal and anything that I was able to catch. Needing to keep the little bait I had for trapping, I started giving Lobo some dry dog food again. Pouring out a pile for him, I looked at it and thought again, what the heck? I picked up one chunk and popped it in my mouth. Not that bad at all. Taking a few more, I got busy cooking my oatmeal and bannock. More important than the food was the fact that I was down to half a small jar of coffee now. That did not go over too well. I made it a little weaker to try and prolong the inevitable, but I knew it was not going to last till the plane came. Washing down the bannock and oatmeal with the coffee, I packed for my day's journey while finishing my second cup. Chain Lakes was my destination for today. As an afterthought, I threw a handful of dog food into my pocket and got underway. With no beaver traps left set on this trail, I knew I would have to start making my bait pieces really small. Crossing Hiawatha Lake, I was happy to see a nice mink hanging in the first set. I moved along, checking trap after trap. Flying squirrel here and a red squirrel there was all the action for miles. Finally, I had a marten at Lake 7, but it had been half eaten by a fox. The thing would have had to stand on its hind legs to reach the hanging marten, but it had managed somehow. I guess they were getting as hungry as I was. Popping a few bites of dog food into my mouth every once in a while, I covered the miles and arrived back at camp with nothing but a mink and a squirrel for the fur bag. Not the best day on the trap line, but I guess they all couldn't be winners. Supper was what it was and I forced it down. At least I was not as hungry as usual since I'd eaten a whole pocket of dog food. I tried to enjoy the last of the bannock, knowing that from now on it was oatmeal as a staple. Oh, and dog food also. Maybe I would come across a grouse or two on the trip to Amabel in the morning. Darkness arrived and I sat pondering my situation. There's only 23 miles to the train tracks according to the game warden. My trip tomorrow would be more than half that distance. I could make it easily in 2 days. No, Dave, just wait for the plane, I told myself. But the thought kept nagging me in the back of my mind. Sipping on my tea, I wonder what Bill and Dawn were doing back in town. Probably eating hamburgers and drinking a beer or two. Enough of that, so I turned on the radio and let the music lull me to sleep. Tomorrow, like always, would be another long day. About a 13-mile return trip, but at least didn't have to sleep in that other cabin again. December 15th. With the arrival of morning, I found that I didn't really want to leave my bed, and only the thought of a hot coffee dragged me from under the covers. With my standard oatmeal for breakfast, I delayed the inevitable, and the first time I was really not looking forward to the day's travel plans. And knowing that there wouldn't be a lot of fur in the traps made the thought of the walk a lot less exciting. With my pack loaded and my shoes strapped on, I headed north, down the lake shore. Once again, I munched on the dog food that Lobo had graciously lent me. All that I was hoping for was a beaver in the one set that I'd left on this trail. With a marten caught just before the Little Fraser River, my spirits were buoyed a little. And being such an incredibly gorgeous day, it was hard to stay in a sour mood for long. My chickadee buddies flirted along beside me for a while, and they never failed to bring a smile to my face. With a squirrel in the set just past Otter Lake, I was again hopeful there would be a beaver to eat my snare set. Chopping the ice away, I hopefully lifted the snare pole and knew right away that I had better enjoy the dog food on the way home. There were no beaver in this set. The snares were sprung, however, and the bait gone. Nailing some fresh bait on the dry pole and lowering it back into the water, I moved on to check the otter set. The trap was sprung, and what do you know? A mink had gone for the fake fish lure that I'd made. And I was lucky enough to have the large jaws catch him across the waist. Cool. Twice checked and I'd caught an otter and a mink in my new set. Turning back now was going to be a long 7-mile walk back to camp, munching on the dog food as I traveled. I was just getting onto Hiawatha Lake when darkness fell. But not to worry, as my trail was packed and easy to follow. Once I was back at the cabin, I did my evening chores, cooked up a small batch of oatmeal, and settled in to skin what I could, which was nothing since the mink was still too wet and the marten was still frozen. So with nothing to do and not being able to drink any coffee, I sat and debated with myself about leaving early and walking out of the bush. The more I thought about it, the better of an idea it seemed to me. But it was not something to try on a whim. I needed to do some planning if this was going to happen. I would still have preferred to wait for the plane, letting the radio finally lull me to sleep. Again, I enjoyed dreams of restaurant meals with a pretty waitress serving me my burger and fries. December 16th. Today was another day to spend in camp. Sleeping in, I wanted to get this day over with, so I tried to make it as short as possible. What better way than to sleep late? But eventually I had to get up and eat a little. Coffee was going to be the highlight of my day, I was figuring. And 6 hours later, when I'd worn myself out cutting, carrying, and sodding up a ton of firewood, I had to agree with that. Yeah, the coffee had been good. Boy, it was amazing how little energy I had compared to when I had first arrived here those 7 weeks ago. The lack of quality food was taking its toll on me, I was guessing. But just a few more days and I would have a feast. Not even wanting to look at a bowl of oatmeal, I just ate a bunch of the dry dog food for supper and had some hot tea. The warmth of it gave me a little bit of energy, so I skinned my catch from the day before, and with them both stretched, I crawled back into bed to rest up for the next day's trip. Pody Lake was the destination, and I gained hope for a better catch than I'd been getting. Not even bothering with the radio, I just closed my eyes and went to sleep. December 17th. Staring at the bowl of oatmeal, it took all I had to stuff it down my throat. I swear to God that after this I would never eat another bite of that horrible food. But knowing I needed the energy, I finished it all, and with my pack loaded, I made my way out of camp and strapped on my snowshoes. My coat pockets were full of dog food. At least that had some taste to it. And as I set off towards Pody Lake, I looked back and noticed that Lobo was not with me. Fine, I thought to myself. He can stay at camp today. He must have been as tired as I was, so I would let him rest. Passing my marten traps with each one either not sprung, needing fresh bait, or holding a squirrel, I was getting more and more depressed with the lack of fur production. Past wolf snares, more marten sets, and the occasional mink set, I could not understand where the animals had gone. Not even any wolf tracks. Arriving at Pody Lake, I turned south when suddenly I heard a wolf howl from behind me. Listening carefully and trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, I suddenly had a chill. That was not a wolf howl. I recognized that voice. That was Lobo, and there could only be one reason for him to be howling from that area that sound was coming from. Turning, I started on a full-scale run down the snowshoe trail that I had just traveled over. I just knew that he was caught in one of my wolf snares. Hopefully I would get there before he strangled himself. Tripping a couple times, I finally rounded a corner, and there he was, sitting there. He got the snare caught around his neck and then just sat down and called for me. Boy, the relief was unreal. That was one smart dog there. Removing him from the snare, I reset it, and since I was almost back at the camp, I decided to return and continue this trip tomorrow. Once I was close to camp, I cut down a tree for firewood and dragged it back with me. The rest of the day I spent cutting fuel for my wood stove, checking my fishing lines, and like usual, I caught nothing. Dog food and oatmeal for supper tonight. With nothing to skin after supper, I just relaxed and called it an early night. Maybe tomorrow would bring better luck. All I could do is hope. At least it could not get worse. Just thinking of the train tracks only some 20 miles to the south made me consider walking there and hopping a train into Hornpain. I could do it in 2 days easy. But no, Dave, just get that idea out of your head and wait for your taxi. But it was still there hounding me as I fell asleep. December 18th. Again, the breakfast was just shoveled in because I knew I needed something in my belly. With my pack still loaded from the day before, I moved down the trail, making sure Lobo was right with me this time. To my surprise, I found a nice marten in the second trap that I passed. This was a bonus, and hopefully a sign of better things to come for today. But that was just a dream, and as I hit Pody, with not even another trap sprung, I followed the trail to my fox set. Here I finally came across some wolf tracks, and they had gone to the bait and taken it all. Now this set was useless also, with no bait to replace it. So I just added some scent to the tree and hoped that it might entice a fox to investigate. On I traveled with a squirrel here and there, but no marten at all. I was so tempted to reset the beaver house as I passed it, but thought that even if I did, the meat would not help me much, since I wouldn't be back here till the day before the plane arrived. Along the trail past Little Pody, I found some grouse tracks in the snow and decided to follow them and see if I might get an opportunity to snag them. But after a 20-minute tracking job, the trail ended with the marks of its wings in the snow where it had taken flight. Oh, my mouth had watered as I followed that bird. But for now, I just popped a few dog food pellets into my mouth and continued on my way. Back in camp with one marten and a couple of squirrels, I hung them and made myself a cup of tea. But still, I couldn't get the train tracks out of my head. I stared at the map, which was cut off halfway to the tracks, and tried to visualize where the camp might be that the game warden had said was the start of the trail that led to the tracks. I was sure wishing that I had a whole map with me. Never mind, Dave. Just hold on, the plane is coming. Well, I skinned the squirrels, but the marten was still frozen, so it would wait until morning. Again, I let the radio lull me to sleep as I tried to force the thoughts from my head. I was sleeping way too much. It was not like me, and I knew it was a lack of quality food sapping my energy. A new plan, December 19th. Guess what? As I awoke, I realized something. If I walked out of here, I could save $150 that I needed for the airplane trip. And the other thing was that if I flew out, how was I going to find the spot on the train tracks where the trail started? I would have no idea where to go with my snowmobile when it was time to come back. Do you remember me saying earlier that about how you could rationalize anything if you wanted it bad enough? Well, there you go. And besides, what if they forgot about me? But no, they couldn't do that. My truck was parked in their driveway. Not even repulsed by the oatmeal this morning, I made my second cup of coffee and saw that there was only enough for a couple more cups left in the jar. Another reason to leave in the morning. With that decision firmly entrenched in my brain, I took off toward Chain Lakes with a newfound spring in my step. Even the empty traps, the lack of grouse, and the general waste of time that it seemed to be walking all those miles and not catching a thing was not enough to get me down. I was just 2 days away from some real food and some good coffee with cream and sugar in it. By the time I had reached the Little Fraser River, my pockets were empty of my traveling snacks, and I was still furless for the day. As I traveled, I tried to make plans for the trip tomorrow and how I would go about finding this fabled trail that would lead me to the train tracks and beyond to food. My last few traps before getting to Hiawatha Lake were empty as well. The trip along the lake went by quickly, with my mind occupied on the details of the next day's travels. The other bonus of saving the airfare would be that I would have that much more money to purchase a snowmobile with. In camp for the evening, I gave Lobo a large pile of dog food and kept a bunch out for myself also. I was wondering if there would be any food left in the cabins along Nagogami Lake. Maybe, as long as they were not locked and I could replace anything that I took, of course. Finally, back at camp, I set about packing for my trip. Really realizing right off that there was no way I was going to be taking all my fur out of there, I decided it would be just the squirrels and the weasels that would come on this trip. The Hudson's Bay store in Hornpain, like most Hudson's Bay stores of that time, did buy furs. But of course, they didn't pay what I would get at the sale. I mean, they had to make a profit too. So they were only getting my squirrels, so I'd have some quick spending money. And by that I meant restaurant spending money. Slipping them into a bag, it totaled 47 squirrels and 6 weasels, and into my pack with the axe, a good-sized bag of dog food, and anything else I thought I might need. With the pack only weighing about 25 pounds, I figured I would make some good time tomorrow. With those plans all set in my mind and the pack loaded, I finished a hot tea and hit the sack. Tomorrow would for sure be a long day. December 20th, D-Day. It was time to leave. My plan was to follow the western shore of Ngaugamay Lake until I found a lodge and then look for this fabled trail to civilization. With only about half of Ngaugamay Lake actually on the map, I was really just taking a guess. If I didn't find the trail by the time I reached the bottom of the lake, I was prepared to hit the bush and compass straight south until I reached the train tracks. And believe me, I had no illusions about getting there in one day, and was fully prepared to spend the night huddled around an open fire if I had to. But hopefully I would find a lodge to stay in for the night. And oh boy, would it be nice if they had left some food from the fall season. Strapping on my long shoes, I hoisted my pack and turned for one last look at my home for the last 2 months. The twinge of regret that I was leaving was quickly smothered by a longing for food. And then I took my first step on a long journey south. Lobo seemed to know something was different today too. He had his tail wagging and seemed more energetic somehow. Maybe it was just my imagination, I thought, as we walked out onto Hiawatha Lake for the last time until after the new year. Without another look back, I followed my pack trail across the lake to my turnoff point. From here on, I knew it was going to be a challenge. If my directions were correct, I had about 22 miles of unbroken trail to travel down over the next 2 days. That is not that bad of a walk on a broken trail, but in this kind of snow conditions and in my physical state, I knew it would be test my endurance like no other trip I had been on. From the point that I left my trail, we traveled another mile and we're on the ice of Ngaugamay Lake. Moving south down the west shoreline, we went no more than a mile or so when I saw a cluster of beautiful log cabins high on the embankment overlooking the expanse of this huge lake. They looked like fairly new buildings, but I was not venturing across the lake to inspect them any closer. I knew for sure that this could not be the camp that I was looking for. Staying about a quarter mile from shore for several reasons, I stayed out of the buildup of soft snow where the wind had not blown or not been able to blow it into a hard pack. Plus, from out here, I could see a lot further while looking for the cabins that may be the trailhead. Rounding the point after a few miles, I was awed by the size of this lake. To my right, the shore broke away to the west and then curved back into the north. That was the bay where Pody Creek emptied into the lake, and there were several islands in the bay that I wiggled my way through as I watched for buildings. I spied another group of cabins a few miles further along, but this spot was still on my map, so I knew that these were not the ones that I was looking for either. This second group was actually one huge building with some outbuildings around it. I passed fairly close to it and then cut across a big bay to hit a long, skinny point that jutted out in the lake at a northeast angle. From this point on, I was mapless. I'd hit the cutoff spot and would now go by guesswork. With the deep snow, I was figuring that I must have been doing about 2 miles an hour. Having to stop every once in a while to rest from the heavy trail braking was really slowing me down. In several places, I could feel a buildup of slush under the snow surface, but in each case, I was able to stay on top of it, not have to worry about my shoes icing up. But no need to overexert myself. I did have a long way to go, and I knew I would not be getting there today. Rounding the point, I followed the shore west, and soon came across another group of cabins. If the other camps had looked new, If the other camps had looked quite new, then these were their grandfathers. Very well built and in great shape, but they did like they'd been here for a long time. In front of the main cabin stood 3 of the biggest trees that I had ever seen. They were white spruce, and 2 of them had to be 5 feet across at the base. They were even bigger than the huge white pine trees that grew north of the Severn River, where I trapped just north of Orillia. But the good news was I was now at a place to spend the night. I just hoped that the door was open. I tried it, and sure enough, it was unlocked. As I said before, most cabins in the North Country were not locked in case someone got stranded. And besides, locks only keep honest people out, and if someone wanted to steal your stuff, a locked door only meant that you would have a broken door to fix on top of things. Inside I prayed, and sure enough my prayers were answered. I found some coffee. But the only food was a pound of lard in a sealed pail. Well, I was not that hungry yet. Taking the large cooking pot, I brought some snow inside to melt for water and built a fire in the wood stove. With the snow melting, I decided to strap on my snowshoes and take a look around for the trail. It didn't take me long to figure out that this could not be the camp that I was looking for. The trail was supposed to head south, and from here, south was across the lake. But just in case, I did a walk around the camp. There was a trail heading off into the bush, but it only went in about a quarter mile to an opening where they'd been cutting their firewood. Finishing my circle, I was satisfied that this was not the spot, but it was sure a nice spot to spend the night, even an actual bed with blankets and all. And to top it off, there were pillows. With an hour of daylight left, I just relaxed, melted snow, drank coffee like I had just invented it. Yeah, it sure beats sleeping in front of an open fire all night eating dog food and snow. This was like heaven. Funny though, all the walking I had done in the past weeks and this one day had tested my legs more than any other day so far. The miles of breaking trail was a test for sure, and it felt good to kick back and relax while sipping on a coffee. Even if my meal was just dry dog food, I felt like a king. And tomorrow I would reach the outside world again. Off to the south I heard a sound that slowly grew louder and louder. It was moving from east to west and seemed like it was very close. The train tracks could not be that far away if I could hear them that clearly. Soon the sky was dark, and with nothing else to do, I decided to hit the sack. It was only about 7 o'clock, but I guess I needed the sleep because I never moved till the morning sun was just lightening the eastern sky. Back to civilization and real food, December 21st. By the time the sun completely cleared the horizon, I was out of the door, into the cold, clear air, and hooking up my snowshoes. I'd probably been asleep for nearly 12 hours, so I was well rested and ready to go. Having had 2 cups of Java and a few handfuls of munchies, I turned southeast and made tracks for the point directly across from the bay from this camp. Aiming to cross between the shore and a tiny island to cover the mile in 20 minutes and move down the shoreline. Only a mile past the island, I rounded a point, and there lay another cluster of cabins. This had to be the spot that I'd been looking for. Climbing the steep trail from the lake level to the top of the embankment that the lodge was built on, I tried to decide where to first look for the trail. Behind the main cabin there was a trail heading into the bush. I followed it, but soon found that it was nothing but a pile of empty 45-gallon drum storage area. Backtracking to the lake shore, I then followed a trail along the edge of the shore, past the last cabin, past the boats, all pulled up on the shore and flipped over, past the bulldozer parked in an opening beside the trail, and on until I was again surrounded by forest. Now this, however, was a real trail, 12 feet wide and for the most part straight as an arrow. I could see several hundred yards in front of me, and then the trail would take a turn and run on for another distance before turning to miss a hill or some other obstacle. It was a mystery to me why there would be a need for a trail this wide, but was to later find out that this trail was used to haul 45-gallon drums of fuel in for the entire fishing season. However, many miles and a couple hours later, I was starting to wonder if I was even on the right trail. From the sound of the train tracks the night before, I didn't think it would be this far. My compass told me that I could be going in the right direction, but I wasn't heading straight south. It was more southwest, and I begun to think that maybe someone out here had just made really nice trapping trails. Continuing on, I passed swamp after swamp until the bush parted, and there it was. Twin rails of steel for as far as the eye could see in both directions. I had no problem knowing which way to turn. Left was my way to town, and I never even let a minute go by as I unstrapped my shoes and attached them to my pack sack. Walking between the rails was an adventure. After weeks of snowshoeing, to have to suddenly try and walk on these ties. They were not at a proper distance for my steps, and I've never felt more spazzy than that first few hundred yards of that trip. Just east of where I connected with the tracks was a sign that read 20. Not sure, but I guessed that it was a mileage marker. Really? I was still 20 miles from Hornpayne? I sure hoped I was not going to have to walk that entire distance into town. The minutes turned into an hour, and the steps, awkward as they were, turned into miles. And by now I was sure the signs were counting down the miles from town. It was kind of nice to walk without my snowshoes on and have something solid to step on. But the odd spacing of the ties could really drive you nuts. A big step, then a little one, then two little ones and a big one. There was just no rhythm to it. And by the time I passed the 16-mile marker, I was praying for a train to come by. A short distance further, I crossed over a large river that was signed as the Obuckamagaw River. It was flowing north, so I guessed that it flowed into the south end of Ngogami Lake. Figured that maybe I could use it to access my trapline in the fall and save on the plane trips. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of an approaching train, and the good news was that it was coming from the right direction. I could see the headlights a long way off, and it took at least 10 minutes to get to where I was. I pulled Lobo off the tracks and waved my arms over my head and instantly heard the engines rev down. Yes, they were going to stop. But as it pulled up beside me, the train just blew right by. However, it seemed to be slowing down, and as the caboose got closer, I could see someone sticking their head out the window on the last car. As the train rolled past, someone yelled that they would be stopped shortly and to hurry and follow if I needed a ride. I didn't really need a ride, but I sure as heck wanted one. Running down the tracks for a few hundred yards, the train finally stopped, and Lobo and I climbed aboard. The brakeman radioed to the engineer to get underway as they offered me a seat and a coffee. After 8 weeks of not a word to another person, I just sort of sat there drinking my coffee as they stared at me. I think that after that long in the bush without a mirror or shower, I must have been a sight. Especially living in a dirt floor cabin. It took just a few minutes till one of them asked me a question. When I answered it, the floodgates were opened. It was like they'd been trying to decide whether I could talk or not. Where did I come from? And how long have you been in there? Along with a million other questions. It was like an assault on my brain. I was actually unnerved, and I think they saw it and backed off a little bit. This must be what it would be like to get questioned by the police. After a bit, my eyes closed from the heat in the caboose, and I dozed off for a while. The sound of the train slowing woke me, and the guys told me that they were on a siding waiting for another train to pass. Soon enough, a passenger train zoomed by heading west at a good clip. At the beginning of my story, I had mentioned that the book Traplines North. Well, in that book, the author, Stephen W. Meter, tells of arriving at Nakina train station on a local passenger train. He would have come down this very set of tracks that I was now traveling on. It had to be this set of tracks, or the one coming from Cochrane, I guess. Those were the only two options. Nakina was only about 100 miles west and north of here. I was so cool thinking that the book that had started my interest in trapping may have had a connection to where I was right now. Once the passenger train was passed, we started underway again, and soon we were entering the Hornpain train yard. They mentioned that I would have about a mile to walk from where we stopped to get into town. No problem, I replied. Better than 16 miles it would have been if you hadn't picked me up. Once we came to a stop, Lobo and I got out, said thanks, and got directions through the yard. It was a huge, sprawling maze of train tracks and trains, all leading to the station at the center of town. Not more than a block from the station was a Hudson Bay Company store. And to my pleasure, right across from the road from that store was a wonderful looking restaurant. With Lobo tied up to the beaver pulling rope, I dropped my pack at the door, removed the bag of furs, and tied him to the pack. Inside, I asked for the manager and then asked if he was buying furs. Thankfully, he said yes, and I brought out my furs, explaining that all I had been able to carry out of the bush were these little guys. Accepting an offer of $1 each, I pocketed the $53, and he asked that when I returned with the rest of my fur, if I would give him the chance to make an offer for it. I told him sure, and made my way straight across the road. Oh, the smell of that place as I walked through the door. Maybe the patrons and waitress said the same thing about me, but I didn't care. There was a real food just minutes away. The waitress brought me a menu and I waved it away, asking for a coffee, a can of Coke, and a bacon cheeseburger with a side order of fries. Oh, and while you're at it, bring me another burger as well. I must have been a sight since everyone seemed to be staring at me. So I went into the bathroom and checked the mirror. Oh my God. I was out in public like this? Giving my face a good scrub in the sink, I finally returned and my food was on the table waiting for me. Oh man, I didn't know where to start, so I lifted the can of Coke and let the bubbles slide down my throat. Are you getting the picture? I was enjoying this to the max, savoring every bite. I had myself a third cup of coffee and then paid and stepped outside with my second burger. Dropping it on the ground for Lobo, I sat beside him and tried to figure out what to do next. It was too late to try thumbing a ride tonight, so I needed a place to stay. Not wanting to spend the rest of my money on a hotel room, I remembered that there was a YMCA in town. Making my way there, I got a room for just a few bucks and had a shower that must have washed 5 pounds of dirt off me. Suddenly, I felt totally beat, and as I crawled into bed, I could hear the music from the bar down the street. It slowly drowned out as my mind shut down. December 22nd. Waking in the morning with a hunger on, I was back at the restaurant at 7 and had my first eggs in a long time. With a few coffees under my belt, I walked down to the highway and stuck out my thumb. An hour later, and only the third vehicle to go by, was my ticket to Highway 11. This fellow was heading west on Highway 11, and my truck was to the east, so I thanked him and started walking. A short time later, I was again dropped off, but this time right at the air service where my truck was waiting for me. Knocking on the office door, I was greeted with surprise that I walked out. Sorry, they said. We were planning on putting a charger on your battery for you so it would be ready for when you got out of the plane. But I guess we can just boost it if it won't start. And it wouldn't. At least they hadn't forgot about me. So with their help, I was again mobile and heading home a short half hour later. The next 2 hours went by quickly as I drove south, passing Hornpain and then arriving in White River, the town made famous as the birthplace of Winnie the Pooh and as the coldest spot in Canada. 72 degrees below zero. Now that, my friends, is cold. Pulling into the Green Gables Hotel parking lot, the first vehicle I saw was Bill's truck. Must be in having an afternoon beer, I thought to myself. Opening the door, I could see Bill at a table and Denny behind the bar. Both came up and with a slap on the back said, "Holy crap, we never expected to see you again." That's weird, I thought to myself. It's only the bush. What could go wrong? Epilogue. For the next 2 weeks, I worked at the bar and made some money to pay for my return trip into the bush. I needed a snowmobile, and with Denny's connection, was able to purchase, with the bank's help, a new Arctic Cat snow machine. The first week of January saw me on the road north again with a big load of supplies to haul in with my machine. Breaking the trail all the way from Hornpain along the tracks turned out to be a challenge as well. I never even sat on a snowmobile before this, so you can imagine the fun I was having, only making it halfway down the tracks the first day. I ended up sleeping in an abandoned cabin on the side of the tracks. The second night again found me in the same camp I had stayed at on the walk out. The third night finally found me at my camp, with my snowmobile stuck in the slush of Nagogami Lake 6 miles back. The next morning I walked back and learned my first lesson of snowmobile travel in the north. Any lake you cross, you need to snowmobile or snowshoe a trail first, and always travel the same trail afterwards. That way it is good for the season. After a few hours of chopping and lifting, I was able to continue on my way along my now packed trail. Between crashing into trees and getting stuck in slush about 1,000 times, I learned a lot about where snowmobiles can and can't go over the following months. 2 weeks later, I brought my fur out and kept my promise to the Hudson's Bay store manager. He didn't offer me what I wanted, so my catch got shipped off to North Bay and the OTA fur sale. The rest of the winter passed by with me cutting trails by hand since I couldn't afford a chainsaw until my fur check came in, and by that time the winter was over. After the first trip along the tracks, the snowmobiling got easier because I just left the machine at the trailhead and took the train back and forth each time. Later that winter, I had the privilege of meeting another very influential person in my life at that time by the name of Joe Cool. Pronounced, cool. And he truly was. I'll tell you some stories about Joe if I ever write another book, because he was a heck of a guy. Sooner than I wanted, my first trapping, My first year trapping in the northern wilderness ground to a halt, with my catch ending up being 43 beaver, 61 marten, 11 mink, 4 otter, 3 wolves, 3 fox, 67 squirrels, and 9 weasels. It was not the greatest catch in the world, but for a greenhorn kid from southern Ontario, I was more than happy with it. But the winter confirmed that I had truly chosen the right course for my life. It was honestly a blast. And now, finally, I can at least look back, or look at, but still not eat oatmeal. Come springtime, I was able to get a job that paid well and fit perfectly into my trapping schedule. I started fighting forest fires for the Ontario Natural Resources Department. This was an amazing job for a young guy, flying into hot spots in a helicopter, putting out fires, and moving on to the next one. I figured it out one time that between firefighting and trapping, I would spend an average of 250 to 275 nights a year in the bush. We traveled to places all over the province and at times to other parts of the country when there were fire flaps picking up and the local fire teams were overworked. The fire season started in May, right after trapping season was done, and it ended in September, just before trapping season started. It couldn't have been any better if I had planned it out myself. Oh, and I finally, later that winter, found out why God had invented slush and tag alders. The tags were used to mark trails across the slush, and the slush was there so the tags would have a purpose. Perfect symbiotic relationship. The end.